speaking of Scott Smitson, he's our next panel moderator, and he's been introduced about 3 times, so I don't think I'll introduce you again, Scott. But the topic for panel 8 is soft support to integrated deterrence. And Scott, I think you're going to introduce your panel now.
Hey, sir, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And before we get started with the panel, I also wanted to thank our colleagues over in Paris and in France for joining us. So, sir, as you said, this is a great opportunity for us in this panel to talk about integrated deterrence. But before that, I just wanted to offer some broad thoughts and then talk about our 2 panelists and then look forward to their great contribution. So for those of you that have been with us for the last 2 days, we've really tried to tackle this idea of looking at the different dimensions of soft support to resilience and resistance through the lens of geostrategy and geostrategic and geoeconomic imperatives. We've heard from allies, we've heard from partners, we've heard from people from the private sector in various elements of the public sector across the interagency, both university contexts and so on and so forth. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is we've kind of looked at these things, and I'll get to the deterrence element in a second, is we keep coming back to these issues of the role of society, the role of citizens, democracy, democratic imperatives, and sovereignty. And this idea of soft helping enable these positivist aims, reinforcing Westphalia, if you will. As our French colleagues mentioned, today is day 1 of a 2-day Summit for Democracies that's being held by the Biden administration in Washington, D.C. And I think that's an interesting kind of prompt because I see this as something key and essential to what's going to be in the forthcoming national security strategy and national defense strategy when we think about how do we preserve and protect and perpetuate our values, the democratic experience being one of them. As we all know, one of the things that the military instrument of power is called to do is to prevent conflict and deter conflict. And as many of us have been kind of tracking over the last few months, this idea of integrated deterrence is going to be kith and kin to what we see and what we believe we will see in these major canonical documents that are coming forward. And so I've got 2 distinguished panelists who are going to help us kind of navigate this issue of integrated deterrence. And I'm going to just introduce them briefly and then turn it over to them. Our first panelist is none other than the president of Joint Special Operations University, Dr. Ike Wilson. Dr. Wilson is a master strategist and is a leading advocate for change in America's ways of thinking about wars and peace and security and defense policy. He's a decorated combat veteran, a former Army aviator and strategist, and most recently served as the director of the Chiefs of Initiatives Group at U.S. CENTCOM, and after that, as the director of the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. A full professor of political science, he served as a professor and academic director at West Point, where he also founded the West Point Grand Strategy Program and has taught extensively at many of the most prestigious colleges and universities across the United States. Dr. Wilson has multiple publications to his credit, to include but not limited to his seminal work, Thinking Beyond War, Civil-Military Relations, and Why America Fails to Win the Peace. Dr. Wilson's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is also an International Affairs Fellow with New America. He's also serving concurrently as a professor of practice with the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. Our second panelist is Mr. Charlie Black. Charlie is the co-founder and managing partner of Zundus Global LLC, a niche transdisciplinary consultancy firm focused on helping individuals and organizations successfully navigate complexity and change. He's a retired Marine Corps officer with over 30 years of diverse experience in and out of uniform in the conventional, special operations, interagency, and international organizations. He's currently a non-resident fellow at JSOU, teaching and conducting research on the future of special operations. As a professional member of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, he provides asymmetric capabilities and innovative experience to national priority projects. He also serves as a board advisor to several private sector corporations. And last but not least, I just want to say it's a great professional honor and opportunity to work with both of these gentlemen and have done so for years. So Dr. Wilson, Mr. Black, thank you both for joining us. Dr. Wilson, sir, I'll hand it over to you first.
Okay, hey, Dr. Smitson, Scott, we're just gonna get real informal here because what I'm hoping we do in this panel 8, Scott, is just kind of have a back and forth conversation. You had sent some great framing questions, framing injects, really provocations around this this puzzle of integrated deterrence and joint combined SOF roles within it. And I'm hoping maybe we just keep our opening kind of comments relatively brief and just have a back and forth conversation, and maybe even enjoying the audience into that. I just want to say I'm equally happy to be serving on the rounding out panel, and couldn't be happier to be serving with both of you and doing so as well. How about if I just quickly start? I want to do 2 things just to quickly start, and I'm going to try to be brief, and then turn it over to Charlie. Let him do the same. We can get into a conversation. First thing, I just want to make sure that everyone is tracking. If you haven't seen already, teammates around the world, yesterday afternoon, a great piece by some of our great teammates, a few of them actually participating yesterday in today's Future of SOF Forum on Resilience and Resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Katie Crome, Colonel Steve Ferenzi, and our own Mr. Rob, the great Mr. Rob Jones from over in the J5 shop. Article popped on Military Times. Title of the article is "Integrating Deterrence Across the Gray, Making It More Than Words." And we'll aim to get the link on the chat so everybody has it. But if you look, I'm sure if you look, you just Google integrated deterrence, I'm sure it's a seminal piece. In fact, I think it's going to be improved to be a seminal framing piece. Timing couldn't be better, in my not so humble opinion, where we are in the drafting from first draft to second to final draft on the NDS, NMS, as well as the NSS. The piece really in plain speak takes a lot of high theory and necks it down into the practical. One of the points I wanted to make today regarding integrated deterrence is, just like all the framing labels, whether it's great power competition, strategic competition, lowercase or capitalized, right, and everything in between to include integrated deterrence. Our colleagues really put meat on the bones, and I think really bring us forward. I think their piece is going to help us not waste, as we've done in past cycles of continuity and change, and wasting a whole lot of time getting overly locked into battles over semantics. And I think we'll be able to have a good enough set of parameters on integrated deterrence and joint combined SOF roles within it. I would add, as part of and in leading the integration of GIMC 3D, if you will, defense diplomacy, and development integrated statecraft solutions. I think they've done yeoman's work in putting some relevant practical meat on the bones. That's comment number 1. With that, Scott, I'm going to start with your first question that you'd given us as a prompt, and the question is, what are the main elements of the emergent concept of integrated deterrence? And just let me give you some what the longstanding seminal works have long had to say about deterrence. Right, beyond and before, the military has done and what we do, best, including for good, bad, and ugly. We militarily jargonized some longstanding fundamental concepts, not just concepts, but theories and theories to practice. So I thought I'd just start. I think first things first, we have to understand the foundational meanings of things, and in this case, the meanings of deterrence itself. So let's start with some longstanding core definitions beyond the military interpretations. So deterrence defined real quick, and there are lots of definitions out there, but everyone would be remiss if they didn't start with some of the fundamental sources, the seminal sources, and namely the sources by Robert Art. His seminal article, International Politics, Enduring Concepts and Contemporary Issues, dating back to at least 1992, his reprint, and going back to the 60s and 70s. On his original offerings on what he called at the time the 4 elements, the the four elements of force, right? And the four uses and utilities of force. And that's really where the conversations need to begin and end with deterrence as, again, at least one of four large pillaring pillars of uses of force, distinguishing force from power. Force, if you look at Newton's power equation, it is one critical variable of several. Force is not power. And I think one of the things that has challenged us always in the American, maybe the wider Western way of peace and warfare. And again, I dig into this pretty critically in my my book from a more than a decade ago. We rue the day when we conflate and confuse power and force, because you set yourself for very brittle things. But what does Art say about deterrence specifically? It's one of four functions of use of force or strategies of influence, right? So now we start from the seminal definitions, long-standing definitions. We immediately, in the definition of the thing, begin to understand and have better appreciation of what influence means, right? Influence is what, the strategies of influence. Deterrence is one of the critical four functions of use of force. It's about dissuasion, dissuading an adversary from taking a course of action by posing the prospect of risk and cost outweighing any prospective gain. Timing in the initiative is left to the opponent when it comes to deterrence. According to DoD, now we start getting the military refinements, deterrence is the prevention from action by fear of the consequences. Deterrence being a state of mind brought about by the existence of a credible threat of unacceptable counteraction, right? This is about power and influence. And again, another seminal work that we all need to get very comfortable with, despite the fact that it's theory. And oftentimes we'll label that academic-y. We've got to get a strategic mindedness to our exquisiteness at the grand tactical through the operational bands of SOF use and utility, because that's where great games are playing out and have always played out throughout history and time. A couple other points, seminal works on deterrence. Deterrence and defense are alike in that both are intended to protect the state or its closest allies from physical attacks. Purpose of both is, again, dissuasion, persuading others not to undertake actions harmful to oneself. Defense use of force dissuades by convincing the adversary that he cannot conquer one's forces, not just military forces, but all categories and elements of force and forces. The deterrent use of force dissuades by convincing the adversary that their population and territory will suffer terrible damage. In the nuclear game, we used to call that counter force and counter value. In the human security game of today and the future, I would offer strongly that we need to get back to original concepts of counter force and counter value, and then expand our understandings, our cognitive appreciations in our practices in that sense to the human security domain, the sub-state and subnational levels of thought and practice. A couple of more thoughts and I'll pause. Whether a state or any entity can defend or deter or do both vis-a-vis another depends upon at least two factors. First, the quantitative balance of forces between it and the competitor or adversary. And secondly, I would say most importantly, the qualitative balances of forces. Note I did not just say military force. The qualitative balances of all forces in favor of the offense or the defense. These two factors are situation specific, meaning they are different configurations of and combinations of force across that entire spectrum, a continuum of cooperation, competition, conflict, and war, across that entire continuum. And I think I'll one more point. From a strategic standpoint, deterrent strategy and collective security explicitly involves, and we've got to get comfortable with this concept once again, a part of our rediscovery. Preponderance, not the preponderance of one state or entities or one alliance achieved in a competitive power struggle and available to serve the policy of its possessors, but the preponderance of the community achieved through the cooperative combination of its members and available to serve the peacekeeping policy of that community. This, I would offer, is where resilience and resistance, in that order, becomes foundational and paramount to integrated deterrence in general, and particularly to Joint Combined SOF's leading role in the direct and indirect integration of all forms of force towards the realizations of the outcomes intended by integrated deterrence. That's my opener. A little longer than I probably should have taken, but that's on the table. Charlie, make some sense out of all that, please, and looking forward to your comments.
No, it's impressive. You're ahead of time. We're good. I do want to thank you.
And for once,
for inviting me to. I don't know if I'm the foil or what. But I do want to build on some of the ideas you just talked about. I think, and I did see that article yesterday as well. I think I read it this morning. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about will resonate with you. It's similar because it comes out of some of our other discussions. I think that if you're not special operations, the new strategy that's coming out, you're cheering for it. If you're conventional forces, it's a return to something a little more familiar. It gives you more focus. It's threat-centric. If we compare that to the strategic competition that we're in or preceded, many of the conventional forces really struggled. Like, what does that really mean, right? It was. Some would argue incoherent. Some would say it was just too sophisticated. We can argue all that later. I do think, though, that, as you said, Dr. Wilson, the new strategy, integrated deterrence, is doing deterrence, pulling from the old theory, but placing it in the new world, i.e. the term integrated and some of these other things that we've talked about over the last 2 days and outside of this forum. I'm going to back into the discussion of what does this mean for SOF at the end, because I think it's important for me to cover a few things. And as you said, integrated deterrence is just one component of national influence. Over the last 2 days, we've talked about the international rules-based order, and everyone, at least of like-minded states, are trying to preserve that. I think that's great. Our adversaries are working outside of that framework, where they're trying to change that framework. If we execute integrated deterrence effectively, and like the article said, my concern is that special operations, the gray zone, or regular warfare will be ignored. And that's the space within which many of our adversaries are already moving and trying to exploit. And I do believe, and I'll get to this at the end, that this is a place for special operations and our partners. And I'll define how I see that. The world is rapidly changing around us. And so we have to keep pace with that change. And so if there's, I don't know if they have my graphic or not. I want to look at this through the lens of complexity. And so if we were to look at the world as a complex system, and I don't know if this graphic is really a very simple representation of something that's extremely complex. The point of this is to show that the world is not in stasis. It is dynamic. It is changing. Dependent upon where you are on this graph as a nation state, institution, population group, whatever identity you choose, the immediate surroundings may be quite static for you. So you as an individual, group, or institution may not be feeling the change. Others may. The evolution of this system is happening rapidly, but it's usually on the periphery of the system. The periphery being both let's relate this to the real world, geographically on the periphery, virtually periphery, in the electromagnetic spectrum on the periphery. These are the edges where change and the signals of change can be discovered. This is a place where special operations can best maximize its core competencies. This is below likely the state level. This is at the sub-state among populations, right? The challenge with that is that our government does state to state, and this is good. We need to do that. But where we're best positioned is for this space, and I'll come to that. If we look to one of our adversaries, the PRC, the One Belt, One Road initiative, and I heard a couple of the other speakers today, I agree with them that we shouldn't be trying to challenge or undermine or diminish the One Belt, One Road. The PRC is pursuing its goals. Some of those areas on the periphery may not matter to us. Why waste energy there? Other places they do. But I'm gonna reconnect back to the One Belt, One Road here in a second. So let's consider an alternative view of resilience if we look at it through a systems lens. So there's an emergent field of network typology, and essentially what it says is I'm going to compare sort of our approach now and offer something for the group to consider. Usually when we consider alliances, or for special operations, I've created my soft network and I've created a connectedness with friends, and I strengthen those lines between us, right? Well, the emergent science of network typology, which overlays to biology and some other things, is challenging some of the Darwinian notion of the strongest survive. What they're arguing is that those that are more connected survive, those that are connected in more diverse ways survive, and those that can change their connections, meaning divest and invest in connectedness, those that can do that the quickest, sort of back to Boyd's OODA loop, I guess, in one weird way, are the ones that are most positioned to be inoculated against malign or disruptive behavior. Now, that could be by a state in our case, right? It could be the Chinese, the Russians, or some other. So if we tie this full circle back to special operations, Dr. Collins and the ambassador earlier today were talking about their experiences, which I thought were great, their panel. And one of the things the ambassador said is we have these wonderful American professionals on the edge of the empire at the embassies, at the US missions, but they lack and oftentimes cultural, local awareness and understanding. Again, that's a gap for the US government. It's not a gap for US special operations. So I'll come back to that. So what I would offer for us, resilience is not about the state per se. For us, it's about people and population groups. It's not about government, it's about governance. It's about the local level, sub-regional level over national level. Other people are going to operate at that level among our JSOU partners, but that may not be the place where we can best bring our tools to bear. And so if we come all the way back, what's the role of special operations? I think that our role is to design and co-create interventions in this complex system by, through, and with a whole range of JSOU partners. So I'm not envisioning a reframe of the global soft network. I'm using the term plural, networks. There are many of them. Some of them are connected in different ways, and we need to be connected from the state to the local level. We can use our core competencies that are our history. We can just use them in a different way. We should not be seeking to counter. We should be pursuing our own nurture networks that advance the rules-based order, that advance our interests. Now, concurrent to that, that might diminish and degrade our adversary, what they're trying to do, but we should not be the little kids chasing the soccer ball. We should be pursuing our own goal. In special operations at the sub-state level can nurture networks. It can increase connectedness between individuals, groups, populations, institutions. So we should think globally, but act locally. And that's going to be driven by where our interests are. So in the end, resilience, as everyone said the last 2 days, really is it's a holistic approach. Special operations role are doing things we already know how to do. We're just doing them for a different purpose, perhaps in a different place, in a different sequence. So I'll end there.
Scott, would you mind if I just react and real quick and reinforce? Sure. My reaction is going to be really reinforcing, I think. And, Charlie, you can be the judge of whether what I think is reinforcing is or not. My words, not yours. But if I could ask the team to, bring up slide, that first slide that talks about SOF's utility as part of full continuum of competition, strategy, strategic influence, just as a backdrop. It's a little set of cartoons. If we can bring that up, and if not, I can try to do so on my end and share my screen. What I'd like to do is just do some reinforcement of what Charlie put on the table. First and foremost, Charlie, I agree with everything you said in terms of making a critical distinction from an integrated deterrence and irregular warfare. frankly, standpoint of what that means for nation, and at the nation statehood level of analysis and thought and practice, in mutually, of course, reaffirming, affecting of that, but distinct of what that means for use utility of joint combined SOF in special operations. I think the distinction is vital. It can't be overly stated, and it can't be repeated too often. I agree with you, Charlie, in terms of the sub-state. Again, that nexus between physical security, traditional nation-state, territorial security, and this sub-state, really political, anthropological, sociological level of human security. That's one of those nexes where we have convergences of what we call compound security threats that are taking place at very specific and historically relevant nexus locations, the seams, if you will, across the world system writ large. Not unique to our times, though it's playing out in unique ways, enhanced by emergent fourth technological revolution, emergent tech. But beyond that, not much new. In fact, very primordial. There are at least 9 and upwards of 18 of those locations on the globe. And this is unclassified. This, you just have to go into the history books and think and revisit what strategists and historians have long pinpointed. We identify and know what those, as Kennan called, strong points are. At the state and sub-state level, we relook and reconsider our own preparedness, presence, our comprehensive joint combined readiness at or proximate to those locations. We look at our allies and so-called anchor partners, and we can do the say-do gap analysis, reconfigure, repurpose, reposture, force projection platforms, not just military force, integrated force at approximate to those locations. That establishes for the United States at minimum, I would say Westphalia writ large, a grand maxi min strategic position, posture, and preparedness. Maximum multilateral, multinational, composite uses of force of multiple types and combinations at those locations for maximum effects through minimum effective cost investments. Vital in this day and age, particularly under globalizing budget stringencies across all nation statehoods across the globe, and particularly so for the advanced industrial nation statehoods of so-called Westphalia. What I wanted to show here is it gets at, Charlie, another point you make, right? And I'm gonna put it in my own words. On the left side, you see the disruptors playbooks, as we like to call it, China's and Russia's. I'll say it more pointedly, the CCP's, Xi's China and Putin's Russia, their disruptive playbooks. You can see how they ally. But a couple of things I want to point out there. They're all negative aims based. That's probably why we rightly call them or regard them, characterize their activities as disruptors and disruptor statehoods, right? It's very easy for us to become envious of that array and that flexibility and that agility of those types of irregular activities. Wrong answer for the United States in any democratic or democratizing type of state of nation statehood. We shouldn't envy it. We should recognize what has always been primordial to the American and wider Western way, and that being positive aim based. And where does the positive aim based build? I would offer fundamentally, it builds at what we've called different things along at different eras. Most recently, building partner capacity. I like to think of it as IRA type investments over the long haul, dollar cost investments in ourselves and our allies and partners that with strategic patience yield exponential dividends, just like in IRA, traditional or Roth, heavy penalties for early withdrawal, right? Think of it that way. And we're reaching 30-year yield, almost literally in the metaphoric sense, right? The metaphor becomes literal at the right time when we're at a threshold crossing. I would draw in that respect to the attention to the right side where it says soften so-called great power competition. Wins are left of boom, operations, activities, and investments. Again, IRA investments, we've been making them for our longest allies, over 150 to 200 years in the making. It's time for those to come to yield. We still have to be strategically patient with some of our more recent and building allies and partners, but for our anchor and longstanding enduring partners, they've come to yield. As long as the United States and Westphalia has enduring partners in this regard, and those disruptor statehoods, those statist regimes, Xi's China and Putin's Russia, can only count on transactional clients, we win. Does it mean that there's a lot of battles and a lot of risks along the way, steps backward as much as forward? Absolutely. Same as it did for the Allies back in April of 1942, when Churchill declared, we've taken the strong points at this point. Unless we screw it up ourselves, game over in terms of the war. Lots of battles to go along the way, many years of battling, steps backwards, retrenchments, losses. But as long as we have partners, real enduring partners, and the other is only approaching their global alternative approaches in a transactional client kind of way, we're on a winning trajectory. Last point, other than the configurations of different types of force at the bottom of the chart. SOF in this role, joint and combined, has always served as, if you will, a metaphoric rheostat. And as long as and that's where the idea of special operations, limited war, low intensity conflict comes from, right? There's a reason why it's called ASD solid. It's a reason why we talk about SOF in low intensity conflict. These are relative perceptive terms, but as the little rudimentary graphic shows, SOFs play as rheostat in Sentinel in terms of early indications and warning, at the edges, at the seams, and in anticipatory perspective profiles and preparedness, help keep the amplitude of contestation low, relatively low, cold you might call it, right? Or no more than warm. And it actually at the same time then gives the nation an escalation ladder management power to extend the periods of relative peace, all on behalf of avoiding a very particular and heinous type of war and warfare, that being apocalyptic war and what we call the great power, the great power transitional contest of great power war. I'll pause there and see if that elicits any thoughts and pushback from my colleagues. Thanks.
Thanks, sir. Charlie, did you have anything that you wanted to add there?
I'll wait until your comments, Scott.
Okay. Well, sir, Dr. Wilson, I appreciate that. One of the things that's kind of struck me over the last few days of our forum is the idea of integration is really kind of suffusing the way that the transatlantic community is thinking about security. So, for example, earlier this spring, the UK government released their integrated security review, where rather than just doing kind of what maybe we did in the past with the QDRs and those type of reviews, they had a comprehensive definition of security, domestic, international, all the different instruments of power with an eye towards allocating resources. We're here today talking a little bit on this panel about integrated deterrence. Charlie, you're one of our foremost experts on integrated campaigning. So there's this cognition that to get strategic effect requires some type of synergy between all the different instruments of power within a government and even amongst the society. But as we all know, there's vast challenges in doing that. So we heard the interagency panel talk about how do you manage tensions. We've talked about how do you do things to scale from a national down to a local level. So what are some, and I'd ask both you gentlemen this question, knowing that if that's kind of the theory of the case of how you bring all these resources to bear in an interagency or a cross-government perspective, where are there the challenges, but also where are there the opportunities, and what role can SOF play in kind of pushing that enabling function going forward to achieve true integrated effect?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Scott. And one, I wouldn't consider myself an expert. I appreciate that elevating me to that level. But I think that this notion of integration, even within DoD, is difficult for some to get their brain around. What I would offer for our purposes for special operations when we hear the word integrated, it is not synonymous with synchronize, be in charge, control, right? Integrate means be aware of what others are doing, recognize their strengths and their weaknesses, recognize your own strengths and weaknesses, and then identify a way in which, if you have a common goal, how you might cooperate. Now, within the government, we have a whole bureaucracy that's its purpose is to, in theory, supposed to help make that happen. Regardless, there's no. I'll use a practical example. If a special operator is in country Y and there's individuals from other intergovernmental partners in country Y, and they meet each other at, I don't know, at the U.S. mission at some meeting, there's no reason that they cannot cooperate without getting permission from home station. They already have their requisite authorities, funding, money, and a mission. But if they determine that they converge on a similar idea, similar goal, there's no reason that they can't choose to cooperate practically on the ground and each mutually benefit from each other's insights, knowledge, resources, et cetera. That's not, I don't think, sort of the natural way. We tend to stay in our own swim lane. I mean, we know that from our time in uniform. You're told that a lot, right? Don't fight the task, stay in your lane, those sorts of things. Well, now it's time to get out of your swim lane. Particularly if you're a special operator or you're part of the special operations enterprise, guess what? You can do backstroke, side stroke, you can do all sorts of things. So you do what you need to do. And the last part of your question, SOCOM's contribution to that is increasing, going back to my earlier points, increasing the connectedness between people. My own personal experience in doing planning and coordinating special operations was our real contribution was the thought leadership in connecting individuals or groups or institutions or populations that had shared interests that didn't know one another existed, and then helping them co-create some intervention on their own. And special operations didn't even participate. All we really did was increase the connectedness between them. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Charlie. Dr. Wolfen, over to you, sir. Mr. Wolfen, I think you're muted.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, let me try to add a couple of thoughts to that. And again, not that we pre-planned this, but Charlie and I are simpatico once again. We'll try to get more conflict and contestation between us to make this more fun. Institutional stovepiping, right? I'm not saying anything here that's not already known, but it bears repeating. Traditional institutional stovepiping, we're still structured. After 20, 30, 40 years of talking about the vital change from an industrial age, all things, to a information, digital evolution and revolution. But we still live in the forms that we were born in professionally. And this really gets to not just institutional stovepiping, but the organizational stovepiping that goes down to identity development level, right? And I think that becomes very vital for education activities like the JSOU. That's one of the reasons why we are reconsidering and rediscovering from the education, from the university and education and leader prep and development standpoint at most fundamental level. Think about it. We, in the armed services alone, the first identity we develop, the professional identity we develop, is the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, now space, cyber. We spend a preponderance of identity development baselining off of those, and then we play a long, hard, oftentimes everything against us catch-up game to then try to get to joint integration. And joint integration, I think I'll be provocative. I wouldn't be surprised if it started to fray around the edges. As good as we are integrated from a joint services standpoint today, if Congress turned their eye away, DOD and OSD turned their eye away and allowed promotions through full bird colonel and into the flag ranks without having to be joint service officer rated. Sorry, that's just my take. In fact, I'm not sorry. I think unfortunately that's true. How far behind are we in terms of where we need to be in interagency, intergovernmental, multinational integration? Now, I'm talking about this problem at the formulation and legitimization or delegitimization of that bureaucratic middle in the echelon mid of the national security and defense enterprise, the apparatus itself. The enemy in the environment, we don't have any problem getting into GMC formations at grassroots level, right? The enemy and the adversary and the competitor are our best teachers. I hate that fact, but if we're all honest about with ourselves, that is the fact. Where we run into the problem is that bureaucratic middle in up echelon in getting to the types of beyond boundaries, trans-domain, trans-boundary, right? Not just multi, but trans, beyond. Another piece, confusion and conflation, again, of force and power. Newton tells us simply, the power equation, force is not power, it's a critical component of. Add to that conflation contributes to task fixation. We write our mission statements, task purpose, when I would offer we need to flip the script and we should focus first and foremost on the purpose of the act, the political object, as Klaus Smitson might call it, and therefore, and then and only then, what types of tasks and what arrayment and what array and what combinations, whether you're focusing on Robert Art's elemental form at the expense of purpose, or understanding and orientation. Again, all this feeds institutional, organizational, cultural parochialisms, right? And not just among the conventional services, we have to guard against this within our own joint combined SOF professional ranks, right? I think it's a discount, undercounting with at this threshold crossing moment. We are not just dealing with traditional, discrete, linear, discrete, and separable threats. China, yes, has to be calculated as a peer threat and a peer rival in power rivalry, more specifically. Russia has a different array as a separate discrete threat line, as does North Korea, Iran, and any number of the array and the constellation of violent extremist organizations. However, that's iteration one of the calculus of a compound security world under the compound security dynamics that we've been a couple of days. You got to go back through and also redo the COFM, redo the calculation of intentional and unwitting proxy and surrogate-based compounding of a China disruptive activity with a Russia, with a VEO, and particularly when they are convergent at particular nexus locations of historically relevant choke points, strong points, weak points, strong points made weak by these convergences and compounding factors, and at the nexus of the physical and the human, right? I'll pause there, but I would add that that is not a happy story structurally or organizational, culturally, identity-wise. Those are not favorable things. Those are high hurdles that we have to first recognize and appreciate and dedicate ourselves of breaking. That's the continuation bias at grand strategic level that we must first recognize, appreciate, and dedicate ourselves professionally to breaking. I'll pause there.
Sure, thanks for that. One of the things I'd like to try to do is pull together a few threads from the beginning of the forum and tie it back to this question of deterrence. So interestingly enough, our first panel talked about resilience and resistance through the 4 ages of SOF. Our allied panel talked about the relationship between resilience and resistance as a means towards deterrence. And on our French panel earlier, we talked about how we're at a back to the futures moment. And your opening remarks talked about resilience from what and resistance to whom. And I think that the broad question of the last 48 hours is if SOF has a unique ability to deliver and support resilience and resistance capabilities to allies and partners at key geostrategic regions and has done so throughout its history, what elements of this need to change? Where do we need to move? So Liam Collins said, hey, we need to think about things in a cyber SOF capability better than the way that we've done it in the past. We've had alternative viewpoints that said, well, we have to think about resilience and resistance in a different framework. So I just wanted to open, gentlemen, and just see kind of, if we know where we've been and we kind of have an inkling of where we needed to go forward, what aspects of those kind of core mission sets need to evolve to be attuned to the new demands of the international security environment as it relates to resilience and resistance? Thanks.
Charlie, you want to go
Uh,
first?
Yeah, I'll be pretty short. I think if you go back to the complexity graphic I showed, I think what's different, Scott, is in 2021, 2030, 2040, the geographic space, the virtual space, and then the cognitive space are intersecting, and they've both expanded and intersected in ways that they didn't in the past. And so we have to be equally sophisticated in terms of applying our core competencies that we're very good at. And then also recognize that the number of actors that can bring forth their own power to shape the system, and these are not just states, these are sub-state identity groups, multinational corporations. So essentially, there's more quicker, and they're doing it across different planes, geographic, virtual, and then the information space. I think that's the difference. And so for us, we need, in which we're doing at Joint Special Ops University, we're educating ourselves to better prepare professionals to do that.
Excellent. Hey, Charlie, I agree with you, but I'm gonna deliberately disagree on a couple of things, or
I always
go at a different angle, just for fun, right? But just know at the heart of it, I agree with everything you just laid out. Conflations and watching conflations, right? Again, power and force, bringing to bear our own and allies and partners' power. If we're really talking about power, right? Work over time, different types, quantities, domains of force, married with unique to them and theirs ways of displacing those combinations of force over time. How the culture and the philosophy of allies and partners in ourselves shape our approach to trade space and trading space for time, particularly at those nexes of where human security, sub-state sovereignty comes into coincidence and collision at the traditional physical, what we call national state, territorial sovereignty lines. That's postmodernism. That is modernity colliding and losing in the contestation with the postmodern world. And I think that's the threshold that we're at today. Our colleagues in this again, what I think should be a seminal work on soft roles and integrated deterrence, the Military Times article, they put on the table, they propose human-focused deterrence. They put on the table 3 forms of irregular deterrence by denial. And again, the partitions of deter by denial and deter by punishment. And they do it to add to the body of deterrence literature and practice. Here they are. Cognitive access denial, in addition to physical denial through support to resistance and financial access denial. They go further and offer 2 forms of irregular deterrence by punishment: unconventional warfare and subversion. I'll let you all go and read the article for their great and rich descriptions of both, but I want to emphasize on the cognitive access denial, right? And I think our support team, I see they still have my slide 1 up. If we can go to slide 2 real quick, I'm feeling froggy, so I just want to provoke. If we go to slide 2, it's the current array of Putin's Russia's COFAM along the Belarus and Ukrainian border. Okay, it's up on my screen. I'm assuming everyone can see this, but it's Russian formations along Ukraine's borders. Let me just chastise this a minute. Let me try to provoke an idea, a frustration among all of us. Look at this correlation of forces and means in a traditional military, physical, kinetic, lethal power sense, right? I mean, if I Rip Van Winkled myself and woke up 30, 40 years ago, I'd be back in one of my strategy classes at West Point as a cadet, or when I was teaching them, and this wouldn't look much different than what we were studying and memorizing on flashcards for the old Soviet formations, right? But this is real. This is not fictive. This is actually what's happening on the border right now in terms of physical force. The question is power. I'm going to go one step further and higher altitude in the provocation. Might this be our 21st century, 2021 equivalent? Could it become the equivalent of us getting over fixated methodical battle syndrome, as we academics call it, as military historians record it? Could this be the Maginot Line? Right, because we're hyper fixated here on this force array, but the Ardennes have already been breached long ago, going back to the Springs movements, going back to the orange and green revolutions of 2006 and 2009, with the Republic of Georgia and the Ukraine then again, infiltrated. First, in many ways, from the physical direct, but most importantly, in the perception and the ideational, that cognitive access, right? It's a breach of deterrence because it's a hide-boundedness in thinking of the four elements, classic elements of force, as separate, not in interchange, in interplay with one another, and only think of it in military force terms, because, and then we add insult to injury by conflating military force with force itself, and then force with power, right? Let's shift to incursions through disinformation campaigning in the national elections, the presidential elections of not just the United States, but before us, all the advanced industrial democratic-like small d powers in statehoods. Perhaps we don't call it what it is. Definitely demonstrations in execution of force, disruptive force. It might just be darn old-fashioned war. All right, but these are the things we have to think about. But is this a Maginot Line we're looking at here? Is that a demonstration of power, or is it a demonstration of force only? Not discounting it, but I'll say only, but a demonstration of that force that's signaling real brittleness in terms of power, from a power calculation. We under integrated deterrence, we have to get more into the power calculations and not stop our analyses at the force calculations. And I'll pause there and I'll come out of this slide.
Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for that. And Charlie, thank you again to both of you for your great contributions on this panel. While I think we answered some of the questions we set out to explore, as we know with these forums, these are just beginnings and flywheels towards greater study and knowledge and understanding, all for the SOF enterprise. So thank you both very much. I know I've failed as my role as a moderator by taking us over a few minutes, so my apologies for that. But I'd like to now turn the floor over to General Howard to close us out. Sir, over to you.
Well, great panel. I wish I had a metaphor like Charlie's swimming metaphor or Dr. Wilson's race car metaphor to close this out. But I'm going to go back to my test question analogy. And if you had to pick a time in history that you could most identify the United States present international security environment, what would it be? Would it be World War I? Be World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, Cold War, War on Terror? What would it be? And the answer would be all of the above, potentially all of the above, perhaps even simultaneously. So handling the eaches of what we've described over the last 2 days is difficult enough. Handling the compound nature of the eaches is doubly, triply difficult. So I guess in closing, I'd say we have a lot of work to do.